When my half-brother, golden child, got married, my dad paid for everything, but he couldn't even spare a kind word for me, and you know that feeling when you're always second best? Or maybe not even on the list at all. Yeah, that's my life in a nutshell. My name's Aiden, and for as long as I can remember, my dad, Greg, has made it pretty clear who his favorite child is. Spoiler alert, it's not me. Growing up, it wasn't always as obvious. My parents divorced when I was 6, and Dad remarried Stephanie a couple of years later. Mason came into the picture when I was 10, and from the start, it felt like I was being slowly pushed out of the spotlight. Mason was Stephanie's son from her first marriage, but you'd never know it by the way my dad treated him. It was like Mason could do no wrong, while I was always the afterthought. Fast forward to now. I'm 27, and Mason just had the wedding of the year. Seriously, it could have been on one of those reality shows. There was a 5-course dinner, a live band, and some kind of fireworks display that cost more than my entire annual salary. Dad paid for all of it, every last penny. He was beaming the whole time, acting like the proudest father on the planet. It was hard to watch. Not because Mason doesn't deserve to be happy. He does, I guess. But because it's a stark contrast to how my dad reacted when I told him about my engagement to Harper. Harper and I have been together for 3 years. She's my rock, funny, smart, and the kind of person who makes you believe in love again. I proposed to her a few months ago in the park where we had our first date. It wasn't flashy, but it was perfect for us. When I called my dad to share the news, I was met with silence, followed by a gruff, "Are you sure you're ready for that kind of responsibility?" No congratulations. No excitement. Just doubt. Meanwhile, when Mason announced his engagement to Ava last year, Dad threw a dinner party at his country club to celebrate. He gave this speech about how proud he was of Mason and how Ava was a perfect addition to the family. It felt like a slap in the face. I tried to brush it off at first. I told myself that maybe Dad was just worried about me. After all, Harper and I don't have the kind of flashy careers that Mason and Ava do. Mason's a financial analyst who's always jetting off to some big meeting, while Ava's an influencer with 1 million followers and a lifestyle brand. Harper and I, on the other hand, are pretty normal. I work in tech support, and she's a kindergarten teacher. We're not rolling in cash, but we're happy. Apparently, happiness isn't enough for my dad. The week leading up to Mason's wedding was a whirlwind of events. A welcome dinner, a rehearsal dinner, a spa day for the bridal party, and golf for the groomsmen. Dad was in his element, schmoozing with everyone and making sure every detail was perfect. He even gave Mason a vintage Rolex as a wedding gift. As for me, I got a text the day before the wedding asking if I'd picked up my suit from the tailor. No, hey, how are you? Or looking forward to seeing you. Just a logistical reminder. When the wedding day finally arrived, I felt like a guest at someone else's family event. Stephanie flitted around like the queen of the ball, making sure Mason and Ava had everything they needed. Dad gave a speech during the reception about how Mason was the son he'd always dreamed of. I stood there, holding a lukewarm glass of champagne, wondering if he even remembered I existed. Harper noticed, of course. She always notices. After the speech, she squeezed my hand and whispered, "Are you okay?" I nodded, but the truth was, I wasn't. I felt invisible. Later that night, as Mason and Ava had their first dance under a canopy of twinkling lights, I caught my dad watching them with this look of pure pride. I tried to remember if he'd ever looked at me that way. I couldn't. By the time the night was over, I was drained. Harper and I left early, slipping out before the after-party started. On the drive home, she gently brought it up. "Aiden, I know it's hard, but maybe you need to talk to him. Tell him how you feel." I shook my head. What's the point? He's never going to change. But deep down, I wasn't sure if that was true. Maybe he could change. Or maybe I just wanted him to care enough to try. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had to give. I couldn't keep pretending that it didn't hurt. Watching my dad go all out for Mason's wedding was hard enough, but his complete dismissal of my engagement felt like a punch to the gut. I've always tried to stay close to him, but now I'm wondering if it's worth the effort. Maybe it's time to stop chasing after someone who doesn't want to be caught. The days following Mason's wedding were rough. Harper kept urging me to talk to Dad, but every time I thought about confronting him, I felt this gnawing ache in my chest. What was I supposed to say? Hey, Dad, I know you think Mason is God's gift to the world, but could you spare some crumbs of validation for me? Yeah, that would go over well. Instead of dealing with my feelings, I threw myself into work. It's not like fixing people's tech issues was some grand distraction, but at least it kept my mind busy. Harper, as patient as ever, gave me space while still dropping gentle hints that avoiding the issue wasn't the solution. She's good like that, knowing when to push and when to hold back. Honestly, if it weren't for her, I don't know where I'd be. A week after the wedding, I finally got a call from Dad. At first, I thought maybe, just maybe, he was calling to check in or apologize for being so dismissive about my engagement. But no, it was about Mason. Hey, Aiden, he started, his tone casual, like we were old buddies. I was wondering if you could come by the house this weekend. Mason and Ava are back from their mini-moon, and we're having a little get-together to celebrate. I gripped my phone tighter, trying to keep my voice steady. Another party? Didn't they just have a wedding? He laughed, completely missing the edge in my voice. Yeah, but this is more intimate. Just family and a few close friends. I wanted to ask if Harper and I were even considered part of family, but I bit my tongue. Instead, I mumbled a non-committal, "I'll think about it," and hung up. Harper noticed the tension as soon as I walked into the living room. "Let me guess," she said, folding a blanket on the couch. "Your dad wants you to celebrate Mason again?" I sighed, sinking into the chair across from her. "How'd you guess?" "Because it's what he always does." "Are you going?" I shrugged. "I don't know. I feel like if I don't, it'll just prove to him that I'm the difficult son." She crossed the room and sat beside me, resting her hand on my arm. "You're not difficult, Aiden. You're just tired of being treated like you don't matter. And you know what? That's okay. You don't have to go if it's going to hurt you." I leaned into her touch, grateful for her support, but part of me still felt trapped. No matter how much I tried to ignore it, I craved my dad's approval. It was stupid, really. I was 27 years old, not some little kid, but that ache was always there, quietly reminding me of everything I'd missed out on. This celebration turned out to be exactly what I expected, a thinly veiled excuse for Dad and Stephanie to show off Mason and Ava's picture-perfect life. Harper came with me for moral support, but I could tell she was as uncomfortable as I was. Stephanie greeted us at the door with a glass of champagne and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Aiden, Harper, so glad you could make it," she said, her voice dripping with the kind of politeness that felt more like an obligation than genuine warmth. "Mason and Ava are out back with everyone else." Harper gave a polite nod, but I could tell she was holding back a snarky comment. We made our way to the backyard, where a small crowd had gathered around Mason, who was in the middle of recounting some story about their honeymoon in Napa Valley. Everyone laughed at his jokes, their admiration palpable. Dad was there, of course, standing off to the side with a proud smile plastered across his face. When he saw me, he waved me over. "Aiden, there you are. I was just telling Mason about that time you tried to cook steak and nearly burned the house down." The group erupted into laughter, and my face burned. I forced a smile, pretending it didn't bother me, but Harper wasn't having it. "I guess we all have our mishaps," she said, her voice cool. "Aiden's gotten a lot better at cooking since then, though. He actually made the most amazing risotto last week." Dad barely acknowledged her comment, already turning his attention back to Mason. Harper gave me a look, silently asking if I wanted to leave, but I shook my head. I wasn't about to let them see how much it was getting to me. The evening dragged on, each moment feeling like another reminder of where I stood in the family hierarchy. At one point, Dad gave yet another speech about how proud he was of Mason for his accomplishments and how Ava had brought so much joy to their lives. It was almost a carbon copy of the wedding speech, but somehow even more nauseating the second time around. When the party finally started winding down, I pulled Dad aside, determined to say something. Harper had been right. I needed to stop bottling everything up. "Hey, Dad," I started, my voice shaky. "Can we talk for a second?" He looked surprised but nodded, leading me to a quieter corner of the yard. "What's on your mind?" I took a deep breath, trying to gather my thoughts. "It's about everything, really. The way you've been treating me. I know Mason's your favorite. That's not true, he interrupted, frowning. I don't have favorites. I let out a bitter laugh. Really? Because it sure feels like you do. You've spent thousands of dollars on Mason's wedding, thrown multiple parties for him, and showered him with praise. Meanwhile, you couldn't even congratulate me when I got engaged. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Aiden, it's not like that. Mason's wedding was a big deal and mine isn't. I cut him off, my voice rising. You haven't even asked me about my plans. Do you even care that I'm getting married? The words hung in the air, heavy and raw. For a moment, I thought maybe I'd finally gotten through to him. But then he shook his head, his expression hardening. You're being dramatic, he said. Marriage is a big responsibility, Aiden. I just want to make sure you're ready for it. I stared at him, disbelief coursing through me. Ready for it? Harper and I have been together for 3 years. We've built a life together. But you wouldn't know that because you've never bothered to get to know her, or me. Before he could respond, Harper appeared at my side, her presence grounding me. She slipped her hand into mine, her grip firm. We're leaving, I said, my voice steady. Enjoy the rest of your celebration. As we walked to the car, I felt a mix of anger and relief. I'd finally said what I needed to say, but it didn't feel as satisfying as I'd hoped. Dad wasn't going to change. That much was clear. The only question was whether I could finally let go of the hope that he ever would. The drive home from Mason's celebration was quiet. Harper reached over and squeezed my hand, her way of saying she was there for me without pushing me to talk. I appreciated it. My head was spinning, replaying the conversation with Dad over and over like a broken record. I'd finally said what I needed to say, but his response felt like a door slamming shut. Harper broke the silence as we pulled into our driveway. Aiden, I think you did the right thing tonight. Even if your dad doesn't see it, standing up for yourself matters. I nodded, but her words didn't bring the comfort I wanted. It just feels pointless. I've been chasing his approval for years, and for what? A lecture about how I'm not ready to get married. Harper turned to face me, her eyes soft but steady. Maybe it's not about getting his approval anymore. Maybe it's about understanding why he's like this. It might not change anything, but at least you'd know it's not about you. Her words stuck with me. I'd spent so much of my life blaming myself for the way Dad treated me, wondering what I could have done differently to earn his love. Maybe it was time to figure out why things had turned out this way in the first place. The next day, I decided to call my mom, Rachel. I hadn't talked to her about Dad in years, not because she didn't care, but because I didn't want to drag her into the mess. She'd always been my biggest cheerleader, even when Dad wasn't. When she picked up, her voice was warm and familiar. Aiden, it's so good to hear from you. How's my favorite son? I chuckled despite myself. I'm your only son, Mom. Exactly, which makes you my favorite, she quipped. What's going on? You sound stressed. I hesitated for a moment before diving in. It's Dad. Things are worse than ever. I tried talking to him at Mason's party, but he just brushed me off. I can't stop wondering why he's always treated Mason like he walks on water while I'm just there. There was a pause on the other end, and for a moment, I thought the call had dropped. But then she spoke, her tone more serious. Aiden, have you ever thought about asking him about the past? About why he and I split up? Her question caught me off guard. I mean, I know you two had your issues, but I figured it was just the usual stuff. Arguments, differences in priorities. It was more than that, she said, her voice quiet. Your dad. He had a hard time connecting with people, even you. When we were together, he always seemed to put work and other commitments above our family. And when Mason came into the picture, well, let's just say things got even more complicated. I frowned. What do you mean? Mom hesitated again, and I could tell she was trying to choose her words carefully. Stephanie had a way of making him feel like Mason needed him more than you did. She painted this picture of Mason as this lost little boy who needed a father figure. And your dad, he fell for it, hook, line, and sinker. It wasn't fair to you, and I told him that, but he didn't want to hear it. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. All these years, I'd been blaming myself for not being enough, but maybe it wasn't about me at all. Maybe it was about Dad's need to play hero for Mason, even if it meant sidelining me in the process. Do you think he regrets it? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I don't know, honey, she said gently, but I do know that it's not your fault. None of this is. After we hung up, I sat there for a long time, processing everything she'd said. It was like a puzzle piece had finally clicked into place, but it didn't make the picture any less painful. As the days passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. Harper noticed my restlessness and encouraged me to talk to someone who might have more answers. That's when I thought of Dylan, my cousin. Dylan had always been close to our family, and he had a way of picking up on things that other people missed. When I called him, he sounded genuinely happy to hear from me. Aiden, man, it's been too long. What's up? I need to talk to you about Dad, I said, cutting straight to the point. And Mason. There was a brief pause before Dylan responded. I was wondering when you'd call. Meet me for coffee tomorrow. I think we've got a lot to discuss. The next morning, we met at a small cafe downtown. Dylan was already waiting when I arrived, sipping a latte and scrolling through his phone. When he saw me, he grinned and waved me over. So, he said, leaning forward once we'd settled in, what's going on with Greg and Mason? I told him everything, Dad's favoritism, the way he dismissed my engagement, the ridiculous spectacle of Mason's wedding. Dylan listened intently, his expression growing more serious as I spoke. When I finally finished, he let out a low whistle. Damn, that's worse than I thought. What do you mean? I asked, my stomach tightening. Dylan hesitated, glancing around the cafe like he was afraid someone might overhear. Look, I don't know all the details, but I've heard some rumors. Things Stephanie doesn't want getting out. Like what? He leaned in closer, lowering his voice. Like the fact that Greg might not even be Mason's biological father. The words hit me like a freight train. What are you talking about? Dad's always treated Mason like he's his own flesh and blood. Exactly, Dylan said. But think about it. Why would he go so far out of his way to prove himself to Mason if he didn't feel some kind of guilt or obligation? It makes sense if Mason isn't really his kid. I shook my head, struggling to process what he was saying. Does Dad know? I don't know, Dylan admitted, but Stephanie definitely does. And if I had to guess, I'd say she's been using it to keep him under her thumb all these years. The thought was both shocking and infuriating. If it was true, it would explain so much: Dad's obsession with Mason, his reluctance to connect with me, the way Stephanie always seemed to hold all the cards. As I drove home from the cafe, my mind raced with questions. Was this the key to understanding everything? Or was it just another layer of a mystery that I'd never fully unravel? One thing was certain: I couldn't let it go. If there was even a chance that Dylan was right, I needed to know the truth. For the next few days, Dylan's revelation gnawed at me like a splinter I couldn't pull out. Could Mason not being Dad's biological son really explain everything? The idea seemed wild, but the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. If Dad was trying to compensate for some deep-seated guilt, it would explain why he treated Mason like royalty while brushing me aside. Harper noticed my mood immediately. She always does. You've been quiet, she said one night as we sat on the couch. Does this have to do with what Dylan told you? I nodded. Yeah. It's just, if he's right, it changes everything. It's not just about Dad playing favorites. It's about lies and manipulation. And if Stephanie's been using this to control him— Harper leaned forward, her expression serious. Then you need to confront him. You deserve the truth, Aiden. Even if it's messy. Her words stayed with me. I wasn't sure I wanted to confront Dad. It wasn't exactly my idea of a good time. But she was right. I needed answers, no matter how painful they might be. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. Dad called me out of the blue one Saturday morning, asking if I could come by the house to talk. His tone was neutral, which was a step up from our usual conversations, so I agreed. Harper offered to come with me, but I told her I needed to do this alone. When I arrived, Dad was in the backyard, trimming the rose bushes Stephanie had planted years ago. He looked up when I approached, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. Aiden, he said, wiping his hands on his jeans. Thanks for coming. I folded my arms, trying to steady myself. You said you wanted to talk. He nodded, motioning for me to sit on one of the patio chairs. I've been thinking about what you said at Mason's party. About how you feel like I've been favoring him over you. I raised an eyebrow. And he sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. I won't lie to you, Aiden. I haven't been the father you deserved. I've made mistakes. Mistakes? I interrupted, my voice sharp. Dad, this isn't about forgetting a birthday or missing a soccer game. This is about years of you treating me like an afterthought while bending over backward for Mason. Don't tell me it was just mistakes. His face hardened, and for a moment, I thought he was going to shut down. But then he surprised me. You're right, he admitted. It's more than that. I've spent a lot of time trying to prove something, to Mason, to myself, and in the process, I've hurt you. I see that now. It wasn't the apology I dreamed of, but it was a start. Still, I couldn't let it go. Not after what Dylan had told me. Why? I asked, my voice quieter now. Why did you feel like you had to prove something to Mason? Dad looked away, his jaw tightening. It's complicated. Try me. He hesitated for a long moment before finally speaking. Mason's not biologically mine. The words hung in the air, heavy and raw. Even though I'd suspected it, hearing him say it out loud felt like a punch to the gut. I found out after Stephanie and I got married, he continued. She told me the truth, that Mason's father left before he was born. She said Mason needed a father figure, someone stable, and I wanted to be that for him. So what? I said, anger bubbling to the surface. You decided to make up for his absentee dad by becoming one for him and forgetting about me in the process? It wasn't like that, he said, his voice rising. I never meant to push you away, Aiden. But Mason, he was different. He needed me in ways you didn't. I stood up, unable to sit still any longer. That's such crap, Dad. I needed you too. I still do. But you've spent so much time trying to fix someone else's broken pieces that you didn't even notice mine. Dad looked at me, his expression pained. I don't know how to fix this. Maybe you can't, I said, my voice breaking. But you could have tried. You still can, if you actually care enough to do it. Before he could respond, the sound of the sliding glass door opening caught our attention. Mason stepped onto the patio, his face dark with confusion and anger. What the hell is going on out here? He demanded, looking between us. Nothing that concerns you, I snapped, but Mason wasn't having it. Don't give me that, he said, stepping closer. I heard what you said. Are you seriously trying to make this about you, Aiden? After everything Dad's done for you? I laughed bitterly. Everything he's done for me? Are you kidding? Mason, this isn't about you being spoiled or entitled. It's about Dad spending our whole lives pretending I didn't exist while putting you on a pedestal. Mason's jaw clenched, but before he could fire back, Dad stepped between us. Enough, he said, his voice firm. This family has enough problems without you two tearing into each other. I shook my head, stepping back. You know what, Dad? Maybe Mason's right. Maybe this isn't about me anymore. But I'm done fighting for scraps of your attention. If you ever figure out how to be a real father, you know where to find me. With that, I walked away, leaving both of them standing there in stunned silence. When I got home, Harper was waiting for me, her concern written all over her face. How did it go? I sank onto the couch, running a hand through my hair. It was a disaster. He admitted Mason's not his, but it doesn't change anything. He still doesn't get it. And Mason overheard. So now that's another mess to deal with. Harper sat beside me, resting her hand on my arm. I'm proud of you for confronting him. That took courage, Aiden. Yeah, well, it didn't fix anything, I muttered. Maybe not, she said softly. But at least you're not carrying the weight of it alone anymore. That's something. She was right, of course. It wasn't the resolution I wanted, but it was a step forward. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe again. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Mason knew now, and if there was one thing I'd learned about him over the years, it was that he didn't like being kept in the dark. Whether I wanted it or not, the truth had been set loose, and there was no putting it back. The fallout from my conversation with Dad hit faster than I'd expected. Mason didn't waste any time digging for answers, and by the next day, he was calling me non-stop. I ignored the first few calls, not in the mood to deal with his righteous indignation, but eventually, I gave in. "What do you want, Mason?" I said, picking up on the fifth ring. "What do I want?" he snapped. "I want to know what the hell you and Dad were talking about yesterday. Is it true? Am I not his son?" There it was. The question I didn't want to answer but couldn't avoid. "I don't know, Mason," I said carefully. "That's something you need to ask Dad or Stephanie. But yeah, he told me you're not biologically his." The silence on the other end was deafening. For a moment, I thought Mason had hung up, but then I heard him exhale sharply. "I can't believe this," he muttered. "Why didn't they tell me? Why the hell didn't anyone tell me?" I didn't have an answer for him. I wasn't even sure it was my place to be having this conversation, but here we were. "Mason, I know this is a lot to process, but maybe you should talk to them," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "I'm sure they have their reasons." "Don't." He cut me off, his voice trembling with anger. "Don't defend them. They've been lying to me my entire life, and now I'm supposed to just accept it? Screw that." I didn't know what to say, so I let him rant. When he finally hung up, I felt a strange mix of guilt and relief. Guilt for being the one to break the news, even indirectly, and relief that the burden of keeping the secret wasn't mine anymore. Over the next few days, things escalated. Mason confronted Dad and Stephanie, and from what Dylan told me, it wasn't pretty. Mason felt betrayed, and honestly, I couldn't blame him. But at the same time, I couldn't ignore the irony. For years, Mason had been the golden boy, basking in Dad's attention and approval, while I stood on the sidelines. Now, his world was falling apart, and I felt, what? Vindicated? Sad? Harper noticed my conflicted feelings immediately. "It's okay to feel torn about this," she said one night as we sat on the couch. "You're human, Aiden. You've been hurt by Mason and your dad for years, and now the tables have turned. That doesn't make you a bad person." "I don't want him to suffer," I admitted. "But I can't pretend I don't feel some kind of satisfaction. Does that make me a terrible brother?" Harper shook her head. "No, it makes you honest. But don't let their drama pull you back in. You've done the hard part. You stood up for yourself. Now it's time to focus on what makes you happy." She was right, as always. But stepping away from the chaos was easier said than done. The next major blow came when Ava, Mason's wife, called me out of the blue. I was sitting at my desk at work when my phone buzzed, her name flashing on the screen. "Ava," I answered, confused. "What's going on?" Her voice was sharp and cold, a far cry from the warm, bubbly person I'd seen at the wedding. "Aiden, I need to ask you something. Did you know about Mason not being Greg's son before all of this blew up?" "Not until recently," I admitted. "Why?" "Because Mason is losing it," she said bluntly. "He's been spiraling ever since he found out. He's drinking more, lashing out at me, and refusing to talk to anyone who tries to calm him down. I don't know what to do." I rubbed my temples, feeling the weight of her words. "Ava, I don't know what to tell you. This isn't something I can fix." "I'm not asking you to fix it," she said, her voice cracking. "I'm just trying to understand what's going on with him. You're his brother, Aiden. Don't you care?" The question stung. Did I care? Of course I did. But that didn't mean I could magically make things better. "I do care," I said finally. "But Mason needs to deal with this himself. He needs to talk to Dad and Stephanie and figure out what this means for him." "I can't do that for him." Ava didn't respond right away, and when she finally spoke, her voice was soft. "I think this is going to break us, Aiden. I don't think our marriage can survive this." I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing. As Mason's life unraveled, I started to find clarity. For the first time in years, I felt like I could see my own path without Dad's shadow looming over me. Harper and I started planning our wedding in earnest, focusing on what we wanted instead of what anyone else thought. It was liberating, in a way I hadn't expected. One evening, as we sat on the floor surrounded by catering menus and floral arrangement samples, Harper looked up at me with a smile. "You seem lighter," she said. "Lighter?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Yeah," she said, leaning against me, "like a weight's been lifted. It suits you." I kissed her forehead, feeling a warmth I hadn't felt in a long time. You're probably right. I think I've finally accepted that I don't need Dad's approval to be happy. That's a big deal, Aiden, she said, her voice full of pride. I'm proud of you. Her words meant more to me than I could put into words. The final chapter of this saga came a few weeks later when Dad showed up at my apartment unannounced. Harper was out running errands, so it was just the two of us. He looked tired, older than I remembered, and there was a sadness in his eyes that I hadn't seen before. Can we talk? He asked, his voice hesitant. I nodded, motioning for him to come inside. I owe you an apology, he said, sitting on the edge of the couch. For everything. For not being there for you. For letting my guilt over Mason cloud my judgment. For being a terrible father. I didn't say anything, letting him speak. I don't expect you to forgive me, he continued, but I want you to know that I'm sorry. I see now how much I hurt you, and it kills me to think I might have lost you because of my own mistakes. His words were raw, vulnerable in a way I'd never seen before. And for the first time, I believed him. I appreciate that, Dad, I said finally, but it's going to take time. You can't undo years of hurt with one conversation. I know, he said, nodding, but I'm willing to do the work, if you'll let me. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a start. And for the first time, I felt like maybe there was hope for us after all. As he left, I realized that breaking free from the cycle of pain and resentment didn't mean cutting ties completely. It meant choosing to focus on what mattered most. My future with Harper, my own happiness, and the people who truly cared about me. And that was enough.